Welcome back to Season 5 of Decision Points. I'm David Makovsky, the Ziegler Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I'm happy to go on this journey with you. In this episode, we'll dive deeper into the terror organization, exploring the evolution of Hamas, the rise of its top leader Yahya Sinwar, and the future of the organization after the Gaza war. The organization known as Hamas was formed as an Islamist militant group at the beginning of the first Palestinian uprising, or Intifada, in the late 1980s. Hamas's charter calls for the destruction of Israel, the murder of Jews, and the establishment of an Islamic society in place of Israel, of what it calls historic Palestine. Before co-founding Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin created the organization the Mujama al-Islamiyah in the 1970s, which did charity work, and Israel had actually licensed the group to operate. When the group became violent in the late 1980s, Israel reversed course and completely withdrew its acceptance for the group and began direct confrontation. After Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005, Hamas became the de facto authority in Gaza, beating out rival Fatah in the 2006 parliamentary elections. After a violent takeover in 2007, where Hamas ousted the Palestinian Authority from Gaza, Hamas has governed the Strip ever since and has spent its time and power amassing military strength. After years of rocket attacks and suicide bombings against Israel, Hamas launched the October 7th massacre, the most significant and deadly terror attack against Israel in the history of the state. At the end of July 2024, Ismail Haniyeh, the influential chairman of Hamas's political bureau, was killed in Tehran in an attack likely carried out by Israel. Yahya Sinwar, who orchestrated the October 7th attack, has taken Haniyeh's place as the leader of Hamas. How has Hamas gotten to where it is today? What role has Yahya Sinwar played in the development of the organization, and what can we expect Hamas to look like in the years to come? For this vital conversation, I'm delighted to be joined by two experts and wonderful colleagues on this topic, Ghaith al-Omari and Ehud Yaari. Ghaith is the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute and a member of the Correct Project on Arab-Israel Relations, which I direct. He was previously the Executive Director of the American Task Force on Palestine, and he has held numerous high-level positions within the Palestinian Authority, including serving as an advisor to the Palestinian Authority's negotiations team at the end of the Clinton administration. Ehud Yaari is the Leifer International Fellow at the Washington Institute, and he's also a member of the Correct Project. He's been the leading Middle East commentator for decades in Israel, and he now holds that position with Israel's Channel 12 TV network. He has also authored or co-authored 8 books on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Ghaith and Ehud, welcome to Decision Points.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
So maybe I'll start with you, Ghaith. To help our listeners understand the role Hamas plays today, I think it would be great to give us a sense of background about the organization. How did Hamas start? Why was it born? Has the group's objectives changed? What factors shaped its development? What are key milestones in the history of Hamas?
Thank you very much, David. The Palestinians, like every other Arab society, have always had Islamists, really since the 1920s. Yet, what's remarkable is that Islamists, particularly of the Muslim Brotherhood brand, in Palestine were never really part of the national movement. They were not part of the national struggle. This started to shift in the 1980s. In 1987, with the outbreak of the first Intifada, I think they figured they cannot stay on the sidelines, and so Hamas was created late in 1987, I believe in December. Now, at the beginning, it was viewed by most as just an irritant. At that time, the PLO, Fatah, were the main actor on the Palestinian scene. Hamas really started getting its kind of identity in the 1988 onwards, when the PLO shifted from the demand of the destruction of Israel and a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. And that's where Hamas started distinguishing itself.
Hold, if I can stop you one thing, to be clear, because you get people who will say, well, didn't Israel support Sheikh Yassin and Hamas in the early days? But then in the early 80s, it was not a violent movement. Was it a branch of the Muslim Brotherhood? What happened? Was it the Intifada that crystallized the shift?
Yes, until the first Intifada, what they worked on was mainly what they call da'wah, which is working through charities, through religious education. They were not part of the national struggle, whether politically or violently. Now, many factors shape the change. Part of it is they started having competition. Palestinian Islamic Jihad was formed a few years earlier, so they started getting pressure from the Islamist camp. But also, I think, with the first Intifada and with the growth of a generation that really grew up after 1967 under occupation, the pressure to play a role became too big, and that's how they joined. So before that, I wouldn't say Israel supported them, but certainly Israel did not put much pressure on them because they were not seen as a threat at that moment. And even in the early years, in some ways, maybe Ehud knows much better than me about this, but in the early years, there was not much pressure on them because they were just seen as a counterweight to the real problem, which was the PLO and Fatah. And in many ways, they were not that involved in terror. I mean, the Hamas that we know today of suicide bombings, etc., was not the Hamas of 1987-88. That really started emerging with the Oslo Agreement. With the Oslo Agreement, they found both their identity in opposition to the whole, what they call compromise over historic Palestine, but also they started developing their methods. And that's when they started realizing that terror pays off. They saw that in 1996 after the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin, where they embarked on some bloody terror attacks that really shifted the course of Israeli politics. During that period, the relation with the Palestinian Authority, which was established early in the 1990s, was competitional, even though at certain points there was, let's say, tacit cooperation. But it really turned into a zero-sum with the Second Intifada. With the Second Intifada, Hamas started, unfortunately, mastering mass terror, shaping the direction of the Intifada, benefiting both from the failure or the, let's say, the weakness of the peace process, but also of the poor governance and corruption of the Palestinian Authority. In 2006, there was a parliamentary election. They ran on a campaign of clean governance, which basically ended in a very organized campaign. They won that elections, leading to a civil war in 2007, in which they expelled the Palestinian Authority from Gaza, and the rest is history.
Ehud, how do you see it?
I see it very much the way Reis, my friend, just presented it. I think it was an excellent intro to Hamas. So I will give you a picture. I used to visit a lot the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, in his very humble house in Jorah neighborhood in Gaza. The guy, he was on a wheelchair or on a stretcher, and the guy who was his caregiver was Ismail Haniyeh, the late chairman of the political bureau of Hamas, killed in Tehran by somebody. And you could see over many meetings the change that was happening with this guy. He was very sharp, very concentrated, if I can use this word, and he has switched because before that, the Israeli civil administration in Gaza viewed his organization, that's pre-Hamas, what he called the Islamic Association, as a counterbalance to the Fatah terrorist network in the Gaza Strip. But at one point, Yassin, in this humble house in Jorah neighborhood, takes a decision to switch the Islamic Association into an armed group. And he gets a guy like Yahya Sinwar, who now leads Hamas in Gaza, to be their chief of internal security, executing people suspected of collaborating with Israel. So as Reis has said, the change in the Muslim Brotherhood Gaza was very fast.
That was in reaction to the First Intifada, or that led to the First Intifada?
During the First Intifada, it was a process.
And you think he did it to be more relevant? He thought that this would make them relevant to the national movement? It's a big shift to go from nonviolence to violence.
I think because the First Intifada broke out without the PLO having anything to do with it, Arafat in Tunis, totally surprised, he understood there was a big void which the Muslim Brotherhood can step in. We just have to keep in mind when we speak about Hamas. In the early 50s, you have to remember that the Muslim Brotherhood volunteers have taken part in our Israeli War of Independence, coming into Hebron, into Gaza, together or separate from the Egyptian army. They were there. So in the early 50s, where the Egyptian grip on Gaza was very loose, the Muslim Brotherhood started organizing armed units. They called them at that time Fedayeen, going into Israel, raiding etc. That was the beginning. This was cut short by the 67, the Six-Day War, and resumed, if you want, by a decision of Sheikh Yassin, late 80s, to go back to armed struggle. Here is what we get. We get ups and downs in the history of the Palestinian wings of the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not a straight, clear road. And still today, if you go to the West Bank today, to some of the leaders in Qatar and in the Gaza Strip, you will have people who think that the whole move was a big mistake.
So let's bring it to Sinwar. For those of us who don't know, this is someone who was released in 2011 from Israeli prison. He was in charge of internal security. Legends began to grow that, I don't know, if he killed 12 collaborators, he strangled them. He was even called Mr. 12 in the prison. And he was someone who read anything he could in Hebrew. He really wanted to use the time in prison as almost an academy to educate himself about Israel and read a lot of books. But he becomes a very ideological, fanatical figure in the jail. I heard stories, I don't know if it's accurate, Ehud, that he was against the Shalit deal because he didn't think it would release enough people and they had to put him in solitary in the weeks before the release. But he, in the end, is released. Israel clearly didn't realize who they had released, which is a story in itself, I would think. We've read in the New York Times and elsewhere that he was even saved by an Israeli doctor who helped operate on him. But explain how he tried to transform Hamas from 2011. Do you think he had one plan? There are some stories that said, no, he actually had a different approach, but there was a very close election in Hamas and multiple rounds of balloting, and he changed his trajectory. So I guess consistency with Sinwar and changes in Sinwar and how he tried to change Hamas, either from the time he got out of prison or more recently in the last few years. How do you see Sinwar as shifting Hamas? Ehud.
Sinwar had reservations about the Shalit deal 2011, in which he was released with many others, for one reason only. The deal skipped some of his best mates, that's the arch-terrorists of Hamas in the West Bank, Abbas Sayed, Brahim Hamed, I will not mention all the names. He saw that his brother, who was holding the Israeli soldier Shalit hostage, should have insisted on them.
That's a very interesting point. Also, that Shalit was being held by Yahya Sinwar's brother, Muhammad. And he did this to get his brother out of jail, but Israel didn't connect the 2 points, it seems like.
People now are saying that Sinwar's brother may be his replacement if Israel manages to target him, which I think we will at one point. He has a certain reputation, which I will not elaborate on your podcast, in Gaza, which will prevent him from becoming the leader of Hamas. Now, Sinwar, when he got out of prison, as the leader of the prisoners, I used to see him there at the different Israeli prisons where he was staying. And he kept in contact with me until about 3 months ago through an intermediary from the tunnels in Gaza. But when he came out, he has managed to find a sponsor. Who was the sponsor? The sponsor was Muhammad Deif, the legendary head of the armed wing of the Hamas, the Izzadin al-Qassam brigades. And during the 2 ballots of elections in Hamas that you have mentioned before, etc., Sinwar was backed, sponsored, supported by Muhammad Deif.
Someone that Israel's tried to kill, 7 times until they succeeded?
7 times and finally succeeded.
On the 8th time. But he was seen as the mastermind of Hamas, a very shadowy figure. Maybe you could explain what makes him the mastermind.
Muhammad Deif was the guy behind many of the terrorist attacks in Israel. Because he has managed to avoid being killed by Israel so many times, he became a legend. People didn't know whether he was really there or not there. So he became a guy who is never in public. You don't have pictures of him. Rarely you would have a short recording of him saying, like on October 7th, we are doing it, etc. So Sinwar was backed by Deif, and together Dave's number two, Marwan Issa, also killed recently by Israel. And they together planned the whole idea of the October 7th. This was something, I have to say it right away, about which immediately, on October 7th, many in the Hamas leadership, including the smartest fellow they had that we killed in Beirut in April, Salah Harouri, they thought it was a huge mistake. But basically what you saw after Sinwar came out from prison is that the alliance between him and Dave and Marwan Issa have managed to take over Hamas, to take over the political bureau of Gaza, make the military wing control Hamas in place of the veteran political activists. That was the big change.
And when did that start? And how much are the tunnels connected? Because some say, look, the tunnels have been going on for a decade. They used to talk about tunnels outside to Israel itself, but they created an internal system. How much was that connected to October 7th? Because that would suggest that this went on for maybe 10 years. I'm just trying to understand, how long has this plan of Sinwar and Def, how long has this been in the works?
Going for a network of unbelievable system of tunnels has started before 2014, much due to the advice given by the Iranians. Because Sinwar and Dave, unlike the previous leader of Hamas, Khaled Mashal, they said, we go with the Iranians. We don't seek the Arab states, etc. And that was the decision. Now, the plan itself was sort of basically put in place, and they started having drills. At one point, they had signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding with Hezbollah. People didn't pay attention to it at that time. It was very important because it led to the Hamas adapting to Hezbollah, IRGC, Iran, doctrine of fighting. And in the Quds Force of the IRGC, they have always a certain top-ranking general who is the head of what they call the Palestine Corps. He was behind what we have seen in Gaza. Now, 3 years they have the plan. Problem, maybe I'm jumping too fast ahead, but the plan was they had deliberations since 2021 until October 7th. Hezbollah, Iran, Hamas, sometimes, not always, Islamic Jihad. Sinwar had his envoys. He sent people, his own trusted mates, out of Gaza 2 months before the war. So he has loyalists outside, and he doesn't have to count on the people he doesn't respect, like Ismail Haniyeh, Khaled Mashal, all those guys in the hotels in Qatar. The problem there was that his people were led to believe by the Iranians, or made themselves believe, that they have a commitment for a full-blown second and third front. And that was the moment that Sinwar, I'm talking now information, not speculation. That was the moment that Sinwar decides to go for a big plan, not for the more modest plan, because they had a modest plan to go for 2, 3 kibbutzim, 1, 2 army positions, get some hostages, force Israel to have a big exchange. They could do it. But no, once he had this commitment, then Dave and Sinwar decide we are going all over the front. 65 kilometers, 60 points of entry, all the way, trying to get to the West Bank, trying to barricade ourselves 20 maybe kilometers outside Tel Aviv, etc. This is Sinwar. He brought something different to the Hamas thinking. You can see the impact of Sinwar. The guy who was one of the top planners of President Sadat's assassination in 1981, that's the Egyptian president who made peace with Israel, came out of prison after 29 years. He comes from a different brand of extremist Islamists. Tarek Zumo is in there. He is now the #1 cheerleader for Sinwar. Historically, they were always critical of Hamas. You have a new map. This is the name of the book, by the way, that this Zumo wrote recently. They have a new map, even amongst the Islamist forces.
So, Ghaith, I want to ask you, how do you see Sinwar, his relationships through others with the Iranians. I'm trying to give people a flavor of who this guy is in terms of being so dangerous, reckless. How do you see how he's changed Hamas?
I'm not sure I have much to add in terms of texture and color to what Ehud does, but I'm going to try to put it kind of in the context of some of the dynamics happening within Hamas. And I have to start from the beginning. I mean, I have to say before I start is I'll be talking about different branches and different trends in Hamas, but we have to be very clear. All of those branches and all of Hamas still are committed to the same core principles: destruction of Israel, creation of theocracy in Palestine, using terror and violence. So yes, they have different methods and whatever, and people talk about moderates. I don't believe there are moderates in Hamas. There are kind of gradations of people committed to the same idea. Now that said, when Hamas took over, won the elections back in 2006, and then took over Gaza in 2007, that was not a unanimous decision in Hamas. Some members in Hamas were very uncomfortable going into governance because governance creates constraints and creates sometimes one would call even moderating factors. They looked at the PA, they looked at Fatah, and how moving from being a resistance movement to being a governing movement has actually, in their view, corrupted it. Now, this remained a question until today, by the way, a contested issue within Hamas itself. So as Sinwar gets released, he gets released into this reality, the reality that it is there, and he tried to play the game. And in the end, he concluded that this actually was not working in Hamas's favor. Some would remember just a few months before October 7th, there was a process, there was almost an understanding between Israel and Hamas where if Hamas de-escalates violence, they get some goodies. Laborers, workers, we all remember the suitcases of Qatari cash going into Hamas. And by the way, I mean, it's not only the Israelis who were doing this. I remember conversations with Egyptian intelligence officials who basically had the same idea. Let them govern so we can control them. So that's kind of one thing. And I think one of the things that Sinwar concluded at a certain point that this is not working well for them. And one of the reasons behind October 7th is going back to basics and sending Hamas back to its roots. So that's kind of one impact. And that's a major impact that Sinwar did. He turned Hamas back into what it was. But two, Hamas has always had competition between different wings. And that actually translated in other ways. While Hamas was founded in Gaza, in reality, particularly after the death of Ahmad Yassin, but even before, the diaspora leadership of Hamas was getting quite influential because they were the ones outside, they were the ones access to money, to diplomatic relations, etc. When Ahmad Yassin was killed in the early 2000s, that's really when the Hamas leadership outside, names that you might be familiar with, Khalid Mash'al, Musa Abu Marzouk, these kind of guys, basically became the center of gravity. And through their connections, particularly after the Arab Spring, with the wider Muslim Brotherhood, with Qatar, with Turkey, they hold the purse strings and they hold diplomatic relations. What Sinwar did was bring back the center of gravity into Gaza. I believe you were in government then, David, when you had the war, 2014 was it? Where basically the diaspora leadership, working with the Qataris and Turks, tried to get some favorable deal for Hamas. They failed. That was the moment where Sinwar came in and brought the center of gravity into Gaza. So that's the second thing that he did. Move it again from the kind of diaspora leadership, the Muslim Brotherhood global network, into the more frankly hardline Gaza. The third is that Hamas has always tried to kind of balance two sets of sponsors. On the one hand, it is a Sunni Arab organization, and therefore its kind of natural milieu is the Muslim Brotherhood and the regional sponsors, again, I repeat, Qatar and Turkey. But also the military wing has always had strong relationships with Iran. Iran was the one that's willing to arm, finance, train, all of that kind of stuff. Right after the Arab Spring, with Iran's stocks basically plummeting in the Arab public opinion, Hamas, which was based in Syria, decided not to work with the Iranians, and that was a decision by Khalid Mash'al. They went to the Sunni camp. And since then, there has been really tension between these two sets of relations. Ismail Haniyeh, who was assassinated recently in Tehran, was elected leader because he was the consensus figure who can basically have relations with both wings. October 7th. With the assassination of Haniyeh, with the quick emergence of Sinwar, the movement is now squarely, at least at this moment, squarely on the Iranian side. Now, this was not obviously Sinwar by himself. This was a set of relationships. As Ehud said, basically there was a very tight link between Sinwar and the military wing, Ghaith, Isa, those guys, which by the way is another shift in Hamas where the center of gravity used to be the politicians and the military, if I can use the terminology, had civilian oversight. Now the military is deciding. But also this was not only him. His frenemy, the guy that, again, Ehud mentioned, Saleh Aruri, who was assassinated, killed by Israel in Beirut in the beginning of the year.
And in charge of all West Bank attacks, right?
But more important than the West Bank, or as important, he was also the guy who rebuilt relations between Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranians. He was clocking a lot of miles between Beirut and Tehran when he was based there. So Sinwar oversaw this transformation of Hamas into what is today a Gaza-centric organization with the military wing having the real say and floating very firmly in the orbit of Iran and its group.
Could you say a word, Ghaith, about Egypt? We know that Egypt is on Gaza's border. Rafah crossing means going between Egypt and Gaza. If Egypt closes that, there's the Mediterranean Sea on one side, and there's two other sides, that's Israel. The Israeli intelligence and the Egyptian intelligence work well together. If you look at the Gaza conflict with Israel of 2008 to 9, 2012, 2014, 2021, and now, Israel has always wanted to work through Egypt, believing that they have leverage on Hamas. Could you say something about the Egyptian-Hamas relationship?
This really, again, goes back to a point that Hamas in Gaza is the outgrowth of the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, if you look at the history of Egypt since the Arab Spring, I'm not going to go beyond that. That was a moment where there was a zero-sum relationship between the Egyptian establishment, what they call the deep state, military, bureaucracy, etc., and the Muslim Brotherhood. Throughout history, since 1929, it was ups and downs, and more downs than ups, but it was many attempts, particularly during Sadat's time, and at some points during Mubarak's time, to basically contain or absorb them or have a detente with the Muslim Brotherhood. After 2011, this was broken. And there's a very strong narrative in Egypt that Hamas was a big part of the kind of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood in 2011. Going into, there's a famous prison there called Aqrab prison that Hamas supposedly stormed and released Mohammed Morsi and others, the former Muslim Brotherhood president of... And there's a whole thing. So initially the relationship was seen purely as zero-sum. We saw when Sisi took over from the Muslim Brotherhood, we saw actually quite a muscular move vis-a-vis Hamas. They flattened the Egyptian side of Rafah to create a buffer zone. They flooded some of the tunnels. They built a wall between all of that. Now things started getting a bit more complicated later on. In 2014, again, I go back to that war. And that was, again, still we're in the Arab Spring. Egypt felt that its two regional competitors, Turkey and Qatar, were trying to usurp the role that you mentioned. Egypt always saw Gaza as part of its border security and national security. In 2014, the Qataris and the Turks, and frankly, I do believe that Secretary Kerry made a mistake of playing that game, tried to basically be the ones who mediate. The Egyptians, of course, flipped. They did everything that they could effectively to thwart these attempts. And at that moment, Egypt said, okay, we need to find some sort of a relationship with the Gaza guys. We might not like them. They might be Muslim Brotherhood, but at least they're not proxies of Qatar and Turkey. That started the relationship. And the relationship was never political. It was done through the intelligence services. And they believed that they could basically, with carrots and sticks, bring Hamas. They invested, before investing in Sinwar, with a guy called Jabari, who was the one who was responsible for the Shalit kidnapping and then later on deal. He was killed by the Israelis. They started investing in Sinwar. And I have to say, like the rest of us, like the Israelis, they were fooled by Sinwar. They bought into the idea that you can contain him. So that's kind of on the political level. Now, on the operational level, yes, Egypt did do a lot to flood the tunnels, etc. But unfortunately, the Egyptian military and intelligence, let's just say, is not the most disciplined force out there. And because of corruption, because of interest, because of whatnot, they never really fully cracked down on Hamas.
Because you're saying the low levels, because they get like just a few dollars a month of salary?
No.
Or do you think it came high up?
Maybe it started low level, but the corporal pays the lieutenant and the lieutenant pays the colonel, and ultimately it goes much, much higher than that. This level of turning a blind eye does not happen on just an ad hoc random basis. I think there was a sense that this is not really a problem anymore, and so let's make some money out of it. And this is really kind of one of the problems right now, complicating this triangle of Israel, Hamas, Egypt, and complicating the current round of hostage talks.
So, Ehud, on that point, there's been a lot of press talk about Israeli view, and you hear two different views, or you could say maybe both are true. One says this was Bibi Netanyahu. He wanted to create division between the PLO and Fatah, West Bank versus Gaza. Remember that they threw out Abbas in 2007, so it's either Hamas or Abbas, and Bibi liked that they were split. Other view says, look, there was an objective problem. There's terrible poverty in Gaza. Nobody wants to pay for Gaza except for the Qataris. And the Israeli military didn't want the lid to blow up Gaza and lead to a war. And that led to, you could call it the conceptia, the governing set of assumptions, bring more workers in, let the Qataris give their $30 million a month. It's okay. We'll do it through the UN program. We'll give coupons to the people who need the money the most. So some say this was a Netanyahu brainchild. Others say, no, it wasn't. It was based on the defense establishment. A third view says, look, it started out working with Nikolai Mladenov, and it was done in a more kosher way. And as we got closer to the 2019 election, Netanyahu allowed suitcases that went directly to Hamas and not through these other UN programs to help poor people. So I'm just trying to understand the origin of this triangle of Israel, Qatar, and Hamas. How much of it is driven by Bibi, how much it is driven by a desire to avoid a war, and how much of it is it started one way, but then Netanyahu loosened the rules as Israel started on this road of several elections in a row beginning in 2019.
My friend David, you know I am not a Bibi fan.
Yeah.
But first I have to say, I have an opportunity to argue with my friend Reis. I think the Egyptian conduct along the what they call now the Philadelphia axis.
That's the Egyptian-Gaza corridor.
Yeah, the border between Gaza is much more serious. It goes well beyond corruption of officers, etc. It's an organized system in which the Egyptian Directorate of Military Intelligence has a share, and the General Intelligence Directorate, which is a different operation, has another share. And they do it through sort of daughter companies, daughter corporations.
What we would call subsidiaries in English. What you say in Hebrew, chavrat bat.
The Egyptian General Intelligence Directorate has the Union of Sinai Tribes, which is basically a business corporation led by somebody now who spent years in Egyptian jails. By the way, I don't want to go too much into it. These are the people who are charging thousands of dollars from every Gazan who wants to cross into Egypt. 100,000 did. So it's a more serious operation that we have there that we, and I think the US, have to talk to Egypt about in the immediate future. Now, about the question of Bibi. I almost feel uncomfortable to explain Bibi's policy, although those years I was talking to him a lot. The point is this: the PA, as mentioned before by Reis, is incapable, corrupt. They are not in a position even to control many towns and cities in the West Bank. It's not that Israel or Bibi tried to make sure there is no unified Palestinian leadership, because a unified Palestinian leadership meant throughout the years a leadership led by Hamas. So what could you do? What you could do is try to tempt Sinwar, allow Hamas to see the benefits of behaving themselves. And if it takes suitcases from Qatar, and you could do it many other ways, as Prime Minister Bennett has demonstrated, you do it. It's not as if Israel had many options, as long as the PA was/is what it is. Now I hear all the talk these days, and I talk to many people on the Palestinian side about President Abbas wants to go to Gaza. And he gave instructions to his security chiefs to do A and B and C. I'm all for it. Let's see whether they can do it. So from an Israeli point of view, and it doesn't matter who is the prime minister, The question was, how do we handle Hamas over those years pre-October 7th? And the answer was, we try to keep them as happy as they are, which meant Israel did not understand two things, which we'll not elaborate upon now. One, Israel never understood what was the Qasem Soleimani doctrine.
Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Al-Quds forces of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, who was assassinated by Trump and the architect of what's known as the Ring of Fire of Iranian proxies around Israel's borders.
You couldn't convince any Israeli politician or general over those years of what the Qasem Soleimani doctrine was. This was one thing that we didn't, or the establishment, including the defense system, very much so, did not understand. And the second thing, they thought that Sinwar was another Hamas leader interested in staying on top, in managing, in outdoing his rivals in Qatar or wherever, and that is not the case. This is the essence of what happened on October 7th, when you have all the information, everything. You have the plan, you have all the signals, you have all the warning signs, and there is some telephone conversation, and they don't even bother to let the commander of the Air Force know. So, because I'm telling you, and I'll finish here, that if there were 10, 12, no more attack helicopters around, it would have been foiled in 2 hours. But they were not.
People want to know about the hostages and the regional war. And there's a view that says, look, with Ehud, what you were saying is that people didn't understand the depth of his ideological commitment against Israel. They thought he was more into survival mode. He spread around this idea that he wants to raise the standard of living of Gazans.
David, not the ideological commitment. This was understood. The operational frame of mind.
And they didn't understand that. Some people say, look, he sees himself like Salah ad-Din. He is not going to make a deal. Some people, certainly on phase 2 of a hostage release, which are the males, because they are literally his human shield. The whole concept is to use human shields in Gaza. But even phase 1, he's hoping for a regional war like Qasem Soleimani, the Ring of Fire. And what you were saying, Ehud, is that there were people that were leading on his operatives to tell him, yes, it's coming. The Muqawama, the resistance, we're all going to be with you on October 7th. And so I guess the question is, how much does he want to deal? There was a recent exchange with Hezbollah where it looked like maybe that would light a match for the region. And yet it seems that this was contained very quickly. The Israeli airport reopened within just a few hours. If the fact that a regional war is not going to happen, and maybe a lot of the credit goes to the United States with its massive deployment in the Middle East, does Sinwar come back down to earth and saying, you know what, this regional war is not about to happen? Whatever the Iranians do to avenge Haniya or not, it's clear they don't seem to be backing Nasrallah, and therefore Sinwar is on his own, and he needs the deal. How badly does he want the hostage deal if there is no regional war as an option? Ehud.
It was not Sinwar's people who said to him there will be a regional war. He led himself, or was led, I'm not sure about this fine point, to believe that there will be a full-blown second and third front. Third front, I mean Syria, on which Putin said, day one, he said, no Syria to the Iranians, and there is no Syria. Second is, Sinwar wants one thing. I'll quote to you something that he sent to me a while ago. He said, you have destroyed Gaza, you have destroyed most of the formations of Hamas. I have to hide, fearing being targeted. What else can you do to me? That's Sinwar to somebody he knows before and from watching many years Israeli television. That's his position. He is saying now, and I'm comfortable saying it in terms of the sources. He's saying now, either I get an end of the war, a total Israeli pullout from Gaza. That's it. Finished. And I pop up from beneath the rubble and declare victory, or I keep a safety belt of hostages around me. That's it. People can work all sorts of formulas, and I watch the negotiations, and we can go into the details. That's the bottom line.
What I hear from you is you're saying, Sinwar is saying to Israel, give me something to lose. If I have nothing to lose, I just keep going.
What he has now going for him is that, for example, most of the Rafah brigade of Hamas fled to the 10 cities of the displaced. Some of them, not most of them, are coming out in civilian clothes with an RPG or a rifle or whatever, explosive charge. From his point of view, this can go on and on and on, etc. So he's saying, if I don't get what I want, end of war, withdrawal, then I can go on like this.
I have nothing to lose, I'll just keep going. Rafe, how do you see it?
I do agree with everything that Ehud said. I will take it a step further. And I would say it's not only he has nothing to lose, I think he believes he has something to gain. Let me preface this by it's always dangerous to kind of attribute to your adversary your own way of thinking. So we look at the strategic picture in one way. I believe he looks at it in a very different way. First of all, yes, the Hezbollah thing has cooled down now. We'll see how that plays in the coming weeks. But he's still probably, hope springs eternal, and he still is waiting to see what the Houthis will do and what the Iranians will do, etc. So the kind of hope of that escalation continues to be there. Two, I think they're working very, very hard on the West Bank. From his perspective, opening a front in the West Bank, and they have been trying very hard through money, through weapons, through pressure, all of that to have that. So he has not seen the hope of a regional escalation that has died. So that's kind of one dimension. But another dimension of it, which is really what Ehud said, we look at it, okay, Hamas's military capabilities, organized, brigades, etc., has been obviously dismantled. Hamas as an insurgency is still quite strong. If there was an end of the war today, Hamas will be the force controlling the ground. Even with its meager capabilities, it is there. So from his perspective, his strategic position is not really weakened that much. That's number two. Number three, he looks at Israel's standing. And I don't have to speculate here. I think it was in the New York Times, there were intercepted calls that he said, more dead civilians is good for me. It ultimately isolates Israel, and he looks at that trajectory and he sees that pressure is mounting on Israel, and he himself, his pressure is not changing. So all of these things actually do not basically create any motivation for him. And I would actually add a fourth thing. I look at Al Jazeera regularly. That's a Qatari TV channel that is basically Hamas's mouthpiece. And if your world is just looking at Al Jazeera, you will think that Israel is going to disintegrate tomorrow. It is weakening, the economy is collapsing, everyone is leaving. Today there was a report about how Israeli weapons are misfiring. It's a fantasy world. But it is the world that kind of milieu lives in. So none of this makes him feel that he is in a bad position. In addition to the hostages being the actual human shields that he has, etc., etc. At the end of the day, it's very hard for me to see how the war can be concluded and how we can move beyond it as long as Sinwar is in charge. He is not someone who feels cornered. He is someone who has proven that his commitment to violence is so deep that he's not someone that one can reason with.
So what's the best way, just going forward, to compete with Hamas? They're not an army anymore. Their capabilities have been greatly diminished. But they could resurrect themselves as an insurgency, a guerrilla terror group. Do you need the PA back? Does that threaten them at all? Or do they figure, look, the people will say, if it's going to be Somalia, chaos, I'll go with Hamas. You can't beat something with nothing. How do you compete with a Hamas that is on one hand diminished and yet feels that it has nothing to lose and feels it could keep going with RPGs, so you don't have 19-year-olds, you have 17-year-olds? And I want to hear from both of you, Ghaith and then Ehud.
I would take a lot of the lessons that we have learned from Iraq and start looking at them in terms of Gaza. Some is maybe spilled milk, but the fact that, we learned the hard way that you have to not only clear, but hold and ultimately rebuild. That's something that Israel could have done earlier on. We've been talking about this whole idea of humanitarian bubbles since the beginning of the year. There was a conscious decision. Israelis have their own reasons for it, but that made it very, very difficult. In the immediate term, to be honest, from a purely security point of view, I just don't see an alternative to Israel doing more to dismantle the insurgency capabilities of Hamas. Today, the Palestinian Authority does not have the capabilities. The Palestinian Authority security forces, which are a much, much better force than it was, say, under Arafat, yet this is a force that was created to deal with the West Bank. different kind of training, different kind of equipping, and actually just in sheer numbers. And I'm not even going to mention the fact that they have a major legitimacy and credibility deficit among the Palestinian people writ large, including those in Gaza. And the fantasy that you'll have an international force that will come and shoot at Hamas and be shot at by Hamas, it's very hard for me to fathom. I mean, people talk about the Emiratis coming in. We saw in Yemen when there was a mass casualty event, I think 19 Emiratis were killed in an attack. They pulled out in the same way that we pulled out of Lebanon after the Hezbollah blew up the Marines barracks, etc. It cannot be a third party. So in the short term, I think in security terms, Israel will have to do more if Hamas gets to a point where it's manageable. But that's not enough.
I just want to be clear. Are you saying it'll be some sort of a hybrid like in the West Bank where Israel and the PA, each one having their different roles at different times? It's not purely PA. It'll be some sort of a hybrid.
At this moment, it's not going to be a hybrid. It's going to be primarily Israel. Now, the question is, how do you kind of plan it? An idea of Israel coming in without an end game would basically mean Israel is going to get dragged into this quagmire. I recall, I think it was Rumsfeld or maybe it was Cheney who said, Pottery Barn rules, you break it, you own it.
It was Colin Powell.
Was it Powell? Okay. So that's kind of where we are right now. In my view, the way to do it is a phasing in, phasing out kind of approach. As the PA's capabilities get stronger, Israel does less. This is going to take time. This is going to take fundamental reforms in the Palestinian Authority, not this kind of cosmetic stuff that we see right now. This requires a serious international push on the Palestinian Authority to get its act together. And this will require an interim, also international role. Not an international role in kind of, doing the operational security work, but international role in terms of governance, in terms of managing the reconstruction, maybe in terms of setting up the security framework. But anyone can start, to be honest, with some of these steps right now. I mean, there's no reason why not to start training some additional Palestinian security forces in Jordan, elsewhere, to be in a position when we get to that moment. But in the short term, I just don't see a clean cut. I don't see any force capable of doing the counterinsurgency except for Israel. And by the way, and I will conclude with this, I don't believe that what I hear from Israelis, let's go out, throw the key and let it go to hell. No, this kind of scenario, the Mogadishu scenario that you talked about. But again, this is all operational. At the end of the day, I go back to the old dad joke. If you're being chased by a shark, you don't have to swim faster than the shark, just the next guy. If the Palestinian Authority does not present itself as a viable alternative on two fronts, one front is governance, clean, effective governance. Another front, a credible liberation, if you wish, strategy. It's very hard to imagine how they can compete with Hamas. It's a heavy, heavy lift, and anyone who thinks this is going to be a short process will have to rethink that.
Ehud, I'm giving you the last word. I want you also to deal with this question of what is the best way to compete with Hamas, knowing everything you know about Sinwar and assuming they don't have the capabilities that they had. They might not even want to govern anymore. They'd be happy to do a Hezbollah model where others will govern, they don't govern. But how do you compete with them so they do not return to what they were?
I don't think it's Israel's job to compete with Hamas. Number one, when we talk of the PA, or security forces of the PA coming to Gaza, I'm all for it. But there is no other military armed organization in the world in which you have more officers, including many with ranks about colonel, brigadier generals and above, than the Palestinian Authority security organizations. This is not serious, and it's not going to get serious soon, even if they accept the suggestions of the US administrations and others. They are not there. Number two, Hamas would love, they keep offering it, to have others take over the mission of reconstructing Gaza, rebuilding the sewage system, etc. They are happy, what you called, rightly so, the Hezbollah model. They are happy. We have already negotiations between President Abbas' people and his arch enemy Hamad Dahlan, who sits in Abu Dhabi, about reconciliation within Fatah. Well, we will see. What I think, humbly, I think all the talk about the day after, it's the same about Lebanon, but we are not going there. All the talk about the day after is not sensible. There is no day after. The war will sort of subside at one point. I don't see a day after. I don't see anybody sending policemen into Gaza or sending administrators into Gaza or anything else. What I see is Israel withdrawing from Gaza, maybe maintaining the corridor, carving Gaza into two parts, maybe some presence along the Egyptian border, less important, maintaining a bigger force than we previously had around Gaza, able to raid in and out whenever Hamas pops up, and everybody else is welcome to deal with the situation in Gaza. That's what I see. Is it a very pleasing picture? No. Is it a hopeful picture? Unfortunately not. Is it the more possible scenario? I'm afraid yes.
On that sober note, I want to thank both of you, Ehud Yaari and Ghaith al-Omari, for a very illuminating, very candid kind of assessment of where things are. I want to thank you both for joining us today on Decision Points. Thank you both.
Thank you, David. Always a pleasure.
Pleasure.
We just had a very insightful conversation with Ghaith and Ehud on the evolution of Hamas. A looming question from our discussion is whether Hamas will be able to return to the role it held in Gaza prior to the Israel-Hamas war. While Hamas's military capabilities have been severely degraded over the course of the war, it's probable that Hamas will resurge without a viable and legitimate alternative in Gaza. You can't beat something with nothing. Both Ghaith and Ehud signaled their belief that Hamas is not about to disappear, and both believe that Israel will need to play some type of security role to contain Hamas's ability to pose a threat. Ideally, Israel's security role should not be based in Gaza, so Israel does not have to occupy the area. Both felt there must be a role for reformed Palestinian governance to ensure that Hamas can never rule Gaza in the way it did before October 7th. Competing with Hamas, however, requires a strategy of creativity and determination to ensure a brighter future for the Palestinian people. Thank you to all of our listeners for joining us on another episode of Decision Points. Thank you to my dedicated team of research assistants at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I want to thank Sidney Helbush and Gabriel Epstein, as well as intern David Ederberg. I also want to thank Rob, Hadia, and the production team at Podville Media, and listeners like you for making this podcast possible. Please leave us a 5-star review so we can grow this community. You can find Decision Points on Apple Music, Spotify, Acast, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Download and subscribe to never miss an episode. To our listeners from all over the world, I hope you listen to all of Season 5 of Decision Points.